There are two kinds of men who build things. The first kind builds loudly. They want you to see the scaffolding before the foundation is poured. They want you to hear the machinery running from the street. They want you impressed before the structure is finished, and they will settle for impressed before the thing is even started, if you are willing to give it to them. The second kind just builds. They show up on time. They do the calculations correctly. They pour the foundation while everybody else is still arguing about what color to paint the front door, and they come back the next morning and do it again, and they do not particularly need you to be watching. I have always been the second kind. I never thought this was a virtue. It was just the only way I knew how to work. My name is Joel Pemberton. I am 71 years old. I spent 38 years as a structural engineer, the last 24 of them as a founding principal of Pemberton Structural Group in Hartford, Connecticut. We are not a large firm. We have never been a large firm. We employ 11 people. We take on approximately 40 projects a year, and our name is on work that is still standing correctly across 9 states. I say this not to impress you. I say it because it is the only language my father-in-law ever understood, and for a very long time I made the mistake of assuming he already knew it. That was my error. I owned it. I just didn't correct it until I was ready. His name was Raymond Hargrove. He founded Hargrove and Associates Development in Hartford in 1979, built it into a mid-sized regional development firm over the course of 3 decades, and had the particular kind of confidence that grows in men who succeed loudly and early. Raymond was not dishonest. He was not cruel in the way people who have studied cruelty are cruel. He was cruel the way certain structures are, not because anyone designed them to fail, but because nobody ran the right calculations before they went up, and by the time the stress showed in the material, it had been load-bearing long enough that everyone had stopped looking at it. Welcome to Quiet House Stories. Get comfortable, and remember that the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. I married Raymond's daughter, Patricia, in June of 1983. Patricia was a woman of considerable grace and specific patience, and she had spent her entire upbringing watching her father measure every man in the room against a standard he never made explicit and never stopped applying. I knew this about Raymond before I married her. I want to be honest with you about that. I was not surprised by him. You cannot be surprised by whether you have been living in for 18 months. What I failed to calculate, and I was a man whose livelihood depended on calculating structural load, was how long the weather would last, and what the accumulated weight of it would eventually cost. The first comment came at Thanksgiving 1985. Patricia and I had been married 2 years. I had just taken on my 3rd independent project, a mid-sized commercial building off Asylum Avenue in Hartford, a solid piece of work I was genuinely proud of, and I mentioned at the table because Patricia had asked me to, because she was proud of me, because she wanted her father to see the shape of the life we were building together. Raymond listened. He finished cutting his turkey. He set his knife down with the particular care of a man who is choosing his words. He said, "That's solid work for someone starting out." And then he turned to his son Christopher and asked about Hargrove's latest acquisition in the Farmington corridor. It is a specific kind of dismissal, that one, the kind that wears the clothes of a compliment, so that you cannot object to it without sounding ungrateful. I put in the file cabinet I keep in the back of my chest, the one where I store information I am not ready to act on, and I went back to the table and talked to Patricia's mother about her roses. Her mother had 6 rose bushes along the back fence that she tended with what I can only describe as professional dedication, and she was happy to discuss them at any length, and I was happy to let her, because it was Thanksgiving and the turkey was good, and the alternative was sitting there stewing about a man who had managed to insult me in 14 words without technically saying anything insulting at all. This is not the kind of thing you take to your wife on the drive home. Patricia knew her father. I didn't need to explain the topology of what had happened at the table. She put her hand on my arm somewhere on the 91 North, and I put my hand over hers, and we drove the rest of the way in the specific, comfortable quiet of 2 people who understand each other well enough not to fill every silence with words. We had that, Patricia and I. We had it from the beginning, and we kept it carefully. This went on for 22 years. I want you to understand what I mean when I say 22 years. I mean Thanksgiving 1985 through October 2007. I mean Claire's baptism and both of my son's college graduations, and the summer we built a deck on the back of the house on Sycamore Lane, and the Christmas Patricia's mother got sick and Raymond sat in my living room drinking my scotch while he told me, while he was drinking my scotch, that Patricia would have had more professional stability in her life if she had married someone with a regional presence. I am not a contractor. I have a professional engineer's license, a master's degree from UConn, and at that point in my career, 18 years of peer-reviewed structural work behind my name. But I was Patricia's husband, the contractor. I mean the firm retreat in 1998, where Raymond introduced me to three of his colleagues as Patricia's husband, the engineer, with a particular inflection that men use when they mean to say something is adequate while technically saying nothing of the sort. I mean the dinner in 2002 where Raymond's son Christopher announced that Hargrove was expanding into Providence, and Raymond said, looking at me across the table, "That's what ambition looks like, Joel. That's what it looks like when a man really commits." Christopher was 37. He had been handed the expansion budget and the market analysis by his father's VP of development. He had not built anything from nothing in his life. I ate my dinner. I mean the project review in the fall of 2001, when Raymond asked me at a Sunday dinner in front of Patricia and Claire and Christopher and Christopher's wife whether I'd ever considered going the corporate route. I asked him what he meant. He said, joining an established firm, getting behind something that already has momentum. Patricia's hand found my knee under the table. I said that I had my own firm with its own momentum, and Raymond looked at me the way a civil engineer looks at a load-bearing wall he suspects is undersized and said, "Of course you do, Joel. I'm sure it's going well." He was not saying it was going well. He was saying he was choosing to assume it was going adequately, because the alternative, looking at the numbers, which he had never asked to see, might require him to revise the load calculation, and Raymond Hargrove had not become Raymond Hargrove by revising things. There was a pattern in it, and I had identified the pattern early on, and I had chosen not to address the pattern for the same reason. I do not address every hairline fracture I see in a structure on my first visit. Some things you monitor, you document, you return to, you watch the rate of change. You do not call the building owner in a panic over a crack that has been stable for a decade. You keep your notes. You wait for the data to accumulate. I mean the Sunday in 2005 when my grandson Michael was born. Patricia's daughter Claire and her husband had their first child, and we were all at the hospital, and Raymond held that baby for 9 minutes and handed him back and said, "He's going to need strong men in his life." He was looking at his own son when he said it. He was not looking at me. Michael was 4 hours old, but I noted the direction of the gaze, the way I note everything, and I filed it. I am not a dramatic man. I don't make speeches. I don't slam doors. I have never in my life walked out of family dinner over something that was said to me, and I did not begin doing so in my 60s. What I did instead was what I had always done. I went home. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, and I kept writing things down. The drawer contained, by October 2007, a green file folder, 3/4 of an inch thick, 47 pages. Not all of them were documents. Some were notes written in my own hand, drafting print, small and even, the way I have written everything since graduate school, because drafting print does not drift across a page the way regular handwriting does, and I have always preferred precision to expression. Some of them were project summaries. Some were letters of commendation from engineers, architects, building inspectors, and one letter from a state senator whose district included the Whitmore Bridge rehabilitation project we completed in 2004, which came in $47,000 under budget and 11 days ahead of schedule, and which is, in my professional opinion, the finest single piece of structural work my firm has ever produced. Some of the pages were financial records, not round numbers. The real numbers, $3,847,412 in aggregate project billings for fiscal year 2006. $681,219.47 in retained earnings as of September 30th, 2007. The kind of numbers that arrange themselves into a story when you line them up in a column and let the column do the talking. I had not assembled a folder for Raymond. I want you to understand that. I had assembled it over the years the way certain men assemble things, because the work deserved a record, and because I believed somewhere in the back of my mind, that a record might matter someday to someone in some room. I did not know which room. I found out on a Wednesday evening in October 2007. Patricia and I drove to Raymond's office for what he called a family planning conversation. Raymond used boardroom vocabulary for everything. Family meetings were planning conversations. Holiday dinners were coordination sessions. The conversation began at 7:14 in the evening. Raymond had a legal pad and a pen and a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He explained that Hargrove and Associates was expanding its structural engineering division, that he had identified this as a strategic priority, and that he was prepared to make me a formal offer, dissolve Pemberton Structural Group, bring my existing contracts and my staff under the Hargrove umbrella, and work under the Hargrove name with a title, a salary, and what Raymond described as real institutional support. He presented it the way men present things when they have already decided the answer and are using the meeting to deliver the announcement rather than have the conversation. I let him finish. I looked at Patricia, who was looking at the table with a particular expression she wore when she was being patient in a way that cost her something. I looked back at Raymond. He leaned back in his chair, and he said it. He said, "Joe, you've done fine. You really have. But I think we both know you've done fine for a man without real ambition." There was a silence, the kind of silence that is weight you can feel in your chest if you sit still enough. I said, "I agree." Raymond looked at me for a moment with a slightly uncertain expression of a man who expected resistance and received compliance and isn't sure whether to be pleased or suspicious. Then he smiled. He said, "Good. Then we're aligned." We were not aligned. But there was no point in establishing that in that room, at that table, at 7:31 on a Wednesday night. The work I needed to do was not in that building. We drove home on the 91 North. Patricia was quiet, not the comfortable quiet, the careful quiet, the one that meant she was turning something over slowly and hadn't finished. She reached over somewhere past the Windsor exit and put her hand on my arm, and I put my hand over hers. And we finished the drive like that without a word, because 24 years of marriage teaches you, if nothing else, which silences are for talking through and which ones need to breathe. The chamomile tea steeped for 4 minutes. That is how long it takes and how long I have always given it, since 1991, in that kitchen, in that house. I have made chamomile tea at that counter in every season and in every state of mind, and it has never needed more than 4 minutes, and I have never given it less. Some things you learn correctly once, and you do not revisit them. I sat across from Patricia at the kitchen table. The white coffee mug from our trip to Acadia, the one with the small chip on the handle, the one she has refused to throw away for going on 15 years, sat in front of her, steaming. She said, "You don't have to do anything about this, Joel." I said, "I know." She said, "He doesn't understand what you built." I said, "I know that too." She looked at me for a long time. Patricia has always had the particular ability of seeing exactly where I am without asking me to describe it. She said, "What are you going to do?" I told her I was going to sleep on it. That was true as far as it went. What I didn't tell her was that I had already, in my mind, opened the bottom drawer, and I already knew what was in there, and I already knew the time had come for it to leave. Let me tell you about that night. After Patricia went to bed, I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down Sycamore Lane a car passed, and its headlights swept the far wall, and the kitchen went dark again. I had the green file folder on the table in front of me. I had taken out of the drawer, without quite deciding to take it out, which is how certain decisions work. Not in a sudden resolution, but in the quiet physical fact of your hands already doing what your mind was still pretending to debate. The white mug sat across from me, Patricia's dried chamomile bag still on the saucer. The chip on the handle faced me. I opened the folder. I read through it slowly. Not because I had forgotten anything. I did not forget things I put in writing, but because I wanted to see it the way a stranger would see it. The way a man would see it who had spent 22 years with a confident and incorrect opinion about what a structural engineer from Hartford had managed to build. I read it front to back. I turned the last page over and set it down on the table and sat with it for a while. It looked significant. That is the honest word. It looked like a professional record of a man with considerably more ambition than he had been given credit for, just ambition of the kind that does not announce itself, does not require an audience, and has never in his life cared whether anyone was paying attention, because the work is correct regardless. The bridge is either standing or it isn't. I sat there for another hour. The refrigerator kept humming. The tea went cold. I took one sip anyway, because sometimes you take the last sip of cold tea as a kind of punctuation. Then I took a legal pad out of the desk drawer and wrote down a list of 8 additional documents I was going to add before the folder was ready. It took 8 days. The first thing I did on Thursday morning was call James Whitfield. James had been my attorney for 14 years. He is the kind of attorney who answers his own phone before 8:30 in the morning and who has the quality, which I value greatly, of never asking why you need something before he finds out whether he can get it. I told him I needed a clean written summary of Pemberton Structural Group's corporate structure, its asset valuation as of the current quarter, and its existing client contract schedule, all on his letterhead. He said he could have it by Monday. It was on my desk Saturday morning. That told me everything I needed to know about James's opinion of the situation, even though we had not discussed the situation. The second thing I did was drive to Concord, New Hampshire, on Friday evening. My brother Dennis lives outside Concord, where he grows tomatoes with a level of discipline that I have always found slightly alarming, and minds his own business with the same discipline. Dennis spent 22 years in the Army. He is not a man who fills silences with noise. He is not a man who reassures you before he has established whether you need reassuring. We sat at his kitchen table. He had leftover pot roast. Dennis always has leftover pot roast. It is one of the 3 or 4 things in my life I can count on with total certainty, and I set the folder on the table between us. He read it for 23 minutes. I know because there was a clock on the wall above the stove, and I had nothing better to do than watch it. When he finished, he set the last page down precisely, the way he sets everything down, and he looked at me and said, "What are you waiting for?" I said, "I want to make sure I wasn't being dramatic." He said, "You're not being dramatic. You're being thorough. Those are different things." He thought for a moment. Add the bridge citations, the state ones. Make sure he has to look at those specifically. I already had them in the folder, but it mattered to hear him say it. There is something about showing your work to someone who respects precision, who will tell you if you are wrong without ceremony and tell you if you are right the same way. That settles a calculation in a way that doing alone cannot. I drove back to Hartford on Saturday morning. I stopped at the diner on New Britain Avenue and had coffee and an English muffin and read the paper. It was a good morning. The light was a particular flat white light of a Connecticut October morning that has not yet decided whether to be beautiful or bleak. I thought about what Dennis had said. I thought about what Raymond had said. I thought about 22 years. Here is something I understood on that drive back and in the days that followed that I had not quite understood before, not fully, not in a way that settles into a man's bones and stays there. I had spent 22 years believing that Raymond's low opinion of me was a problem I could solve by doing better work. This is a logical error that structural engineers may be more susceptible to than most, because in our field, the work does eventually speak for itself. A bridge either carries its load or it doesn't. A foundation either holds or it settles. The calculations are the calculations, and there is no successful argument against them once the building is standing. I have been operating on the assumption that Raymond would eventually run the same kind of calculation, would look at the evidence correctly and arrive at the right answer. What I had not accounted for was that Raymond was not running calculations at all. He was running something else. He had a framework, a model of the world in which Hargrove and Associates was a measure of professional ambition, and everything outside it was adequate at best, and had been feeding information into that framework for 30 years and getting the same answer every time. Not because the data supported the answer, because the framework did. Men who build frameworks like that do not update them when the evidence changes. They reinforce the walls instead. Patience is not waiting for something to get better on its own. That is just hoping. Patience is a specific discipline of waiting for the moment when every element is correctly assembled and the only remaining action is to submit the work. I had been patient. The work was assembled. The time had arrived. The 8 days produced 8 additional pages. The state commendation from the Department of Transportation for the Whitmore Bridge project ran to 2 pages and used language I will not quote here, but which was specific and technical, and not the language that gets written for work that is merely adequate. The independent going concern valuation of Pemberton Structural Group, which James Whitfield arranged through a commercial appraiser he had trusted for 11 years, came back at $2,140,000, a specific, non-round number that I placed on the first page of the folder, directly below James's corporate summary on firm letterhead, because I wanted it to be the first line Raymond read. 3 letters of commendation from building owners and project managers in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, men who would hire me once and hire me again, which in this business is the only certification that matters. The client contract schedule showing 14 active projects as of October 2007, with the contract values in a single clean column on the right side of the page. And then the letter. I drafted it 4 times. Not because I was struggling with what to say. I knew what I wanted to say before I sat down. I drafted it 4 times because I wanted to be certain it said exactly what I intended and nothing I did not. The first draft ran long. There was a paragraph in the middle of the second page that cataloged specific comments Raymond had made over 22 years, with dates and context, because I had the dates and context in the file cabinet in my chest, and could produce that paragraph from memory without consulting a single note. I cut it from the second draft. It was accurate. It was also not the point. The folder itself was the point. 47 pages of documented professional history did not require my editorial commentary. What they required was a cover letter that was complete and did not leave Raymond any room to wonder whether there had been a misunderstanding he might be able to work with. The final letter said 3 things: that I declined his offer, that I had reasons, which I explained in plain language across the better part of the page, and that I consider the October 17th conversation to be the last one we would ever need to have on the subject of my professional capabilities. 2 pages, single-spaced, drafting print, every word placed on purpose, not unkind, precise. Those are different things, and the difference matters. And I knew exactly which one I was writing on each of the 4 drafts until I arrived at the one that was right. On the evening of Wednesday, October 24th, 2007, I pressed my charcoal suit and hung it on the back of the bedroom door. Patricia watched me do this from her side of the bed. She said, "Tomorrow?" I said, "Tomorrow." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I've been sure for 22 years. I just finally have everything I need." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, Joel." She turned the light off. That was all. 24 years of marriage, and that was exactly what the conversation needed to be. On Thursday, October 25th, 2007, I arrived at Hargrove & Associates at 9:58 in the morning, 2 minutes early. I walked into the reception area. The receptionist was a young woman named Michelle. She had been there about 3 years, always composed, always professional. She looked up when I came in. I set the green file folder on her desk. I told her that I needed Mr. Hargrove to receive it, and that he would want to read it without anyone else in the room. She looked at the folder. She looked at me. She said, "Of course, Mr. Pemberton." She said it the way people say things when they understand that something consequential is in motion, and they are professional enough not to insert themselves into its path. I walked back out through the glass doors. I drove to the diner on New Britain Avenue. I ordered coffee and an English muffin, the same order I had given myself on Saturday after Dennis, and which seemed correct to repeat, and I read the newspaper. I was not in a hurry. The folder was where it needed to be. There was nothing remaining for me to do. Raymond called at 2:17 in the afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. He called at 2:24, at 2:31, at 2:47 and 2:52. 3 more times between 3 o'clock and 3:30. By 4:15, he had called 11 times and left 4 voicemails. I know this because I wrote it down in the small notebook I keep in my jacket pocket. 11 calls for voicemails, beginning 2:17 p.m., Thursday, October 25th, 2007. The kind of information that belongs in a record. I called him back on Tuesday, October 30th, 5 days later. Not to make him wait. I am not in the business of making people wait for its own sake. I called on Tuesday because that was when I was ready, and because 5 days seemed on reflection like the correct interval. Some silences can communicate things that words cannot, and the silence of a man who said everything he needed to say and does not require response is one of those things. He answered on the first ring. He said, Joel. I said, Raymond. A pause. He said, I need you to understand something. That valuation in the folder. He stopped. Started over. The letter you wrote. I don't think I said, I meant every word of it, Raymond. Longer pause. He said, I had no idea. I said, I know. He said, why didn't you say something? All these years, why didn't you? I said, because you never asked. I said goodbye. I hung up. The call was 47 seconds. In the weeks that followed, Patricia told me about the conversation she had with her father during those 5 days. She did not tell me everything, and I did not ask her to, because those conversations were between a father and his daughter, and they were not mine to manage or possess. She told me he had read the folder twice, once on Thursday afternoon, once on Friday morning, alone in his office with the door closed. She told me he had called his own attorney on Friday to verify James Whitfield's corporate summary, which was his right, and which I had anticipated, and that the verification came back confirming the numbers without qualification. She told me his attorney had also, apparently, made a few calls to people in the Hartford engineering community. She didn't tell me what those calls produced. She didn't need to. She told me Raymond had been quiet during those 5 days in a way she had never seen him be quiet. Not the quiet of a man choosing not to speak, because he has nothing to say. The quiet of a man who is revising something large, something he built and reinforced over a long time, and finding the revision larger than he had expected. Patricia said he had come to dinner on Saturday night and sat at her table and eaten his food and said very little and driven home alone, which was not the Raymond Hargrove she had grown up with, who had never in his life eaten a meal without filling the room around it. She said, Are you glad? I thought about that for a moment. I said, I don't know yet. She said, That's an honest answer. I said, It's the only kind I know how to give. She put the Acadia mug in the dish rack and turned the light off over the sink, and we went to bed, and I lay there for a while in the dark listening to the house settle the way old houses do in October in Connecticut, and I thought about the 47 pages and the 47-second phone call, and I decided that what I felt was not gladness, exactly. It was something closer to completion. The structural load had been correctly calculated. The report had been submitted. The building was going to stand or it was going to be revised, and either way the calculation was done, and I had done it correctly. Some months after the folder, in the spring of 2008, a Friday afternoon, I had coffee at the diner on New Britain Avenue with Raymond's younger brother, Harold. Harold had spent his career as a general contractor, had worked in the margins of his brother's professional world for 30 years, and had watched the whole pattern of Raymond's behavior from a careful distance with the specific perspective of a man who has spent decades being assessed by the same measuring rod and knows exactly how it is calibrated. Harold was not a man who talked very much, which is why I trusted what he said when he did talk. He told me that Raymond had been the second son in a family that kept its admiration for the oldest, that Raymond had grown up fighting for recognition that the family distributed unevenly and withdrew without warning, and that his entire professional life had been, in some sense, an argument with an audience that never knew they were the audience. He wasn't trying to hurt you, Harold said, turning his coffee cup slowly on the diner table. He genuinely didn't know how to see you. You were too quiet and too steady and too much like what he'd spent his whole life trying to become without ever quite getting there. That's the hardest kind of man for someone like Raymond to be around, because you weren't competing with him. You were just living the way he always thought he should have been able to live, and he couldn't figure out what to do with that. I did not know what to say to that, so I drank my coffee. I said, Well, Harold nodded. We finished our coffee and left. There is a specific cost to standing in that place, to being correctly and fully understood, finally, at the exact moment when the understanding arrives too late to change the shape of the years that came before it. I have thought about this carefully, and I do not want to pretend it is otherwise. The folder did what it needed to do. The record says what it says. Pemberton Structural Group is still standing and still doing work I am proud of, but 22 years is 22 years. And there is no document that recalculates the load that was on the structure during that time. You carry what you carry. You do the work. The cost is part of the accounting. About 18 months after the folder, early April of 2009, Raymond came to the house on Sycamore Lane, unannounced, which was unlike him. I was in the front yard doing nothing particular, just standing there with a cup of coffee looking at the rose bushes along the fence line. 5 of them, just beginning to consider blooming in the cautious way they do in early Connecticut April. Raymond parked on the street. He walked up the driveway. He stood at the edge of the yard and said, "Can I come in?" I said yes. We sat at the kitchen table. Patricia made coffee. We sat there for a while without speaking, and I want you to understand that this was, in its way, the most honest conversation Raymond Hargrove and I had in the entire 26 years we knew each other, and the honesty was in the silence as much as in anything that got said. He did not apologize, not with that word. He said, "I underestimated you for a long time." I said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know that I understood what I was doing." I said, "I know that." He drank his coffee. He looked at the white mug in front of him, the Acadia mug, the chip on the handle. For a moment, he said, "You built a good thing, Joel." I said, "I know that too." He left about 40 minutes later. I watched him walk past the rose bushes to his car. They were just on the edge of opening, the way things are in early April in Connecticut, cautious, a little uncertain, but going in the right direction. I stood there with my coffee, and I watched his car pull away, and I thought about the 22 years and the 47 pages and the 47-second phone call, and about Harold's explanation at the diner, and about the specific cost of having been patient for exactly as long as it took. Here's what I have arrived at after all of it. It feels like a ledger that has been carried a long time and has finally been set down, not permanently, and not without a cost. You do not set down a ledger you have been carrying for 22 years without feeling the absence of its weight for a while. But set down. The numbers are in the columns. The columns add up correctly. The work I did was the work I said it was, and the record exists, and the right person read it in the right room at the right time. That is not everything, but it is also not nothing, and I have learned over the course of a long career that the work you can honestly say is not nothing is the work worth doing. The rest is just noise between the calculations. The rose bushes bloomed that spring. All 5 of them, the full length of the fence, the best they had done since 2001. I do not have a structural explanation for that. Some things you note, and you set them next to the things you know, and you do not try to make them mean more than they are. The work is what it is. The record is what it is. The house on Sycamore Lane is still standing correctly, which is all you can ever really ask of a structure. That is enough for me. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Quiet House Stories. I will see you on the next one.